All right. Well, welcome back. It is now April 9th. Of course, you may be watching this a day early, but if not, once again, I'm going to do what I did last time on the 7th. To start off your assignment that is due today, tell me one important thing that happened on this day in history, April 9th, and one famous person who was born on this day in history, April 9th. Hope you guys are all still doing well. We're going to continue with chapter 10 and we'll finish it up today. In fact, this will probably be a decent amount shorter than the last video. We don't have a lot left to cover, but we do have some important things to still cover. So, as a result of a lot of the issues going on with the Indians and the different wars and different battles, I guess I wouldn't say wars, but really battles that have been happening in Indian territory, President Ulysses S. Grant wanted to try to take a different approach, what he felt would be a more peaceful approach, which he called the peace policy. So he asked Quakers, who were members of a Society of Friends denomination, but basically Quakers were total pacifists. They did not want to use violence at all. He chooses a Quaker named Lowry Tatum to lead this effort to try to bring peace between the tribes and the United States. And Lowry Tatum was sent to serve as the Indian agent at Fort Sill for the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache tribes. He held this position until 1873. He had many duties, and one of those was distributing rations uh, and annuity goods. So let's discuss what some of the rations were. These would be things like beef, bacon, flour, coffee, sugar, soap, tobacco, and soda. Now, when we say soda, we're not talking about Coca-Cola, talking about some sort of baking soda, would be the type of soda you're talking about. Annuity goods consisted of things like blankets, brown muslin, salonet, calico, hosiery, needles, threads, sometimes suits of men's clothes, beads, tin cups, butcher knives, iron kettles, frying pans, hose, small axes, man, a lot of stuff there. But you can see that for rations, it's something that you can eat or drink. And annuity goods is something you're going to reuse and not eat. You typically don't eat your blankets or eat your needles. So those would be things that you would use in other ways. Now, the two most prized rations that the Indians on the reservations always look forward to were sugar and coffee. Hey, man, as far as I know, this is for the Indians, but man, things haven't changed. You can see how much you can make if you sell coffee drinks that have sugary stuff in them. Just look at Starbucks; they're doing well. So things haven't really changed. Americans today, much like the Indians on the reservation, like their coffee with sugar in it. Um, Now, the Indians were consistently told if they behaved, that they would get these goods. However, the Indians actually reported something different to Lowry Tatum. They said, and this is a quote from Tatum from things he had heard from the Indians. I'm going to read it directly because it's actually a really good quote. The Indians repeatedly told me that when they behaved well, they got a small amount of goods, and the only way to get a large amount was to go on the warpath a while, kill a few white people, steal a good many horses and mules, and then make a treaty, and they would give a large amount of presents and a liberal supply of goods for the fall. So, in some ways, what Tatum is saying here is the Indians felt like they were being rewarded more when they were doing bad things, to try to keep them from doing more bad things. They were like, we're going to give you a lot of things now to please you. But while they're being peaceful, they felt like they were just getting an average to lesser amount of goods. So, that encouraged the Indians in some ways to be more aggressive because they felt like they could actually get more out of it. Now, the soldiers were restricted by this peace policy in how they dealt with Indians. Like they were told not to fight unless absolutely necessary. So it's kind of like I wouldn't say it's exactly like today, but you have rules of engagement today, and they kind of had been given some rules of engagement to try to keep the peace. Now the Indians saw this as a sign of weakness. Some Plains Indians were very bitter towards the U.S. government and white settlers, and they continued to raid nearby states and nearby settlers. The Kiowa had a chief named Kicking Bird who had been on a pretty good relations with the whites and with the United States government, but he was accused of being a coward. And if you remember from a lecture, probably a month and a half ago or 2 months ago now, even it's been so long ago, we said the most important trait for an Indian was to be brave. So the worst thing to be is a coward. So Kicking Bird was accused of being a coward. So he decided he needed to show that he wasn't. So he took out some of his warriors from the Kiowa tribe and they went into Texas. Some of the young warriors broke away from his group and attacked a mail stage there. So a stagecoach carrying mail uh, at the Little Wichita River. Alerted to the attack, the Texas Cavalry Regiment pursued the warriors. A skirmish followed at Kicking Bird's camp, but the cavalry retreated when they realized that they were very outnumbered. After returning to Indian Territory, however, Kicking Bird dedicated himself to establishing peaceful relations with the whites instead of continuing the war path. But the interesting thing is, he did that simply because he had been called a coward. Uh, so that was such an insult to him that he did not want to be called that he decided to take matters into his own hands. Several agencies were established here, but I'm not going to go through those. If you want to read about that in your book, you can. But I do want us to talk about the Red River War. So the conditions for Plains Indians did not improve much by 1874. Food promised by the U.S. government oftentimes was inadequate and often of poor quality. White hunters were slaughtering buffaloes, which was what the Indians still relied upon primarily for their livelihood. And they would just sell them for, the white hunters would do this for only two reasons: to sell the hide and also for the tongue, which is really weird. But the tongue was considered a delicacy. Like when you went to some restaurant, getting a buffalo tongue apparently was really good. Kind of like some of the things today. I don't get why anybody would want escargot, fish eggs. That just sounds. Snails, or why people would want um, other items that are just sound terrible to me, but they're considered really good things. So, these things are sometimes strange. I don't know why somebody would want a buffalo tongue. You could probably just eat some beef instead. But apparently it was popular. But mostly the hides were what the white hunters were after. So in 1874, the U.S. government declared that all Indians must live on their reservations. Any Indians caught off the reservation would be considered renegades, or a word we might use is outlaws. This reservation restriction was the most difficult part for the Plains Indians. For centuries, these Indians had roamed the plains. They had gone not just from their little area, but they had gone from state to state, what we would call states today, but they would just roamed across the plains, southern plains, northern plains, in search of food. It was just their way of life. So this was a very difficult thing for them. So several tribes get together: the Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, Arapaho, and these groups would be kind of led by the Comanche chief, Quanah Parker, who was, it wouldn't be the whole tribe, but a part of the Comanche. Now, this is where I want to read to you, an important aspect of how brutal the Comanche were. So we understand that sometimes, we hear about, how Indians died in their villages when American soldiers came in. I don't think American soldiers primarily, I'm not going to say ever, but for the most part, were trying to kill women and children. But it did happen. But let's see what Indians were doing. Were they always peaceful towards women and children? So this won't take too long, but it'll be a few minutes. Just how bad things were in 1871 along this razor edge of civilization could be seen in the number of settlers who had abandoned their lands. And this razor, let me just explain real quick, razor edge of civilization would be people trying to settle in northern Texas who were being raided by the Comanche. So it's dealing with that particular area when they're talking about that. The frontier carried westward with so much sweat, blood, and toil was now rolling backward, retreating. Colonel Randolph Marcy, who accompanied Sherman on a western tour in the spring, this is William Tecumseh Sherman, he's still a general. He's now head of the whole United States Army, but he was a famous general from the Civil War. He was on a western tour in the spring, and who had known the country intimately for decades had been shocked to find that in many places there were fewer people than 18 years before. If the Indian marauders are not punished, he wrote, the whole country seems in a fair way of becoming totally depopulated. This phenomenon was not entirely unknown in the history of the New World. The Comanches had also stopped cold the northward advance of the Spanish Empire in the 18th century, an empire that had up to that point easily subdued and killed millions of Indians in Mexico and moved at will through the continent. So let's stop and pause there again. The Comanche were such fierce warriors that where the Spanish had been rolling over and killing other tribes, the Comanche were able to stop their advance. Now, after more than a century of relentless westward movements, they were rolling back civilization's advance again, only on a much larger scale. Whole areas of the borderlands were simply emptying out, melting back eastward towards the safety of the forests. One county, Wise, had seen its population drop from 3,160 in the year 1860 to 1,450 in 1870. In some places, the line of settlements had been driven back 100 miles. If General Sherman wondered about the cause, as he once did, his tour with Marcy relieved him of his doubts. That spring, they had narrowly missed being killed themselves by a party of raiding Indians. The Indians, mostly Kiowas, passed them over because of a shaman's superstitions and had instead attacked a nearby wagon train. What happened was typical of the savage, revenge-driven attacks by Comanches and Kiowas in Texas in the post-war years. What was not typical was Sherman's proximity and his own very personal and mortal sense that he might have been a victim too. Because of that, the raid became famous, known in the history as the Salt Creek Massacre. Now, the next paragraph is going to be the one that really explains how brutal the Comanche were. But I want to touch on one thing before I move on. William Tecumseh Sherman actually came to Fort Sill and was inspecting Fort Sill and discussing what was going on with the Indians in the area. And they actually had some Comanche chiefs that had been taken captive there, and one of the Comanche chiefs escaped, and he nearly killed William Tecumseh Sherman down at Fort Sill. So once again, it shows just how risky these guys were, how violent, how aggressive they were. And obviously this leads Sherman to taking a little stronger stance in this part of Indian Territory in the southwestern part of Oklahoma. It doesn't help that this is what was typical of the Comanche. This next paragraph I read. 7 men were killed in the raid, but it does not begin to describe the horror of what Mackenzie found at the scene. According to Captain Robert G. Carter, Mackenzie's subordinate who witnessed its aftermath, the victims were stripped, scalped, and mutilated. Some of them had been beheaded, and others had their brains scooped out. Their fingers, toes, and private parts had been cut off and stuck in their mouths, wrote Carter, and their bodies, now lying in several inches of water and swollen or bloated beyond all chance of recognition, were filled full of arrows, which made them resemble porcupines. They had clearly been tortured too. Upon each exposed abdomen had been placed a mass of live coals. One wretched man, Samuel Eliot, who, fighting hard to the last, had evidently been wounded, was found chained between 2 wagon wheels and a fire having been made from the wagon pole. He had been slowly roasted to death, burnt to a crisp. So, if you wonder, was there any brutality amongst Indian tribes? That sums it up. Now, this does not mean every Indian tribe was like this. Okay, but the Comanche and even some of these others, to a lesser degree, the Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, were pretty brutal in their treatment, especially of men. Now, when they would raid, doesn't mean women and children wouldn't sometimes get killed, because they would also, but sometimes they would take the women as slaves. If it was a boy, they probably would still kill a boy child, but women and girls they might take. In fact, Quanah Parker, the Comanche chief, his mother had been a part of a white family who had settled in Texas, and her family had been killed. She had been taken captive. There's a whole thing about her in your book on page 251. If you would like to read that, I'm not going to read that whole thing, but if you do read it, I think it's interesting to read. But they leave some things out, saying she eventually was taken in by the Comanche Indians, which was true. But when she first was taken in by the Comanche Indians, she wasn't treated very well, especially by women. Not men. The men didn't treat her poorly, but women treated her pretty poorly. But it's partly to get her to react. And eventually she stood up for herself. And because of that, the tribe began to respect her. She eventually married a chief, and that's how Quanah Parker became a chief. So he was actually half Comanche, half white. But he's a pretty remarkable chief for the Comanche during this time period. They decided to attack a settlement of buffalo hunters in the Texas Panhandle in June of 1874. It was unsuccessful, as 28 hunters there that had long-range rifles. It was pretty hard to attack. They were able to protect themselves. So it was not a successful attack. Over the next year, a number of bloody battles occurred in the Red River War. So this would be the Red Rivers, obviously, like we've talked about, the southern border of Oklahoma into Texas. So a lot of battles taking place in that area and into the Texas Panhandle. From Fort Sill was a big part of where the soldiers would come from. They'd go from Fort Sill down into the southern parts of Oklahoma and northern parts of Texas. The majority of the Kiowa who were fighting were following Kicking Bird and staying on the reservation, but Principal Chief Lone Wolf and Chief Mamonti took a party of 50 into the war. Obviously, you also had the Comanche fighting and members from these other tribes. The military finally broke the resistance by capturing and killing most of the Indians' horses. Without their horses, the Indians could no longer be very effective in their war. Quanah Parker then surrendered in 1875 at Fort Sill. So in June of 1875, Quanah Parker surrendered at Fort Sill. 72 captured chiefs were then taken to prison in Florida, where they were held until 1878. There's not actually a whole lot to talk about with this last battle, the Battle of Turkey Springs, because it is not very large. It wasn't even something that some of the Indians planned on. But a group of Indians, Cheyenne Indians, left their reservation. For this one, however, they go into Kansas. They come across two guys hauling salt from the Great Salt Plains and killed them for their guns and horses. The Cheyenne had not planned on killing people, but they did plan to go back to their home at any cost. They didn't, so they were going to go back to their home and get off the reservation, go back to their original place where they lived. The cavalry here caught up with them in north of Wood County in Turkey Springs. They sent in delegates to try to talk the Cheyenne into surrendering and returning to the reservation, but they refused. So fighting soon started between the cavalry and the Cheyenne. The Indians set fire to the grass prairies. There was no water for the troops or the horses, so they retreated on the 14th. This is 14th of September, 1877. The Battle of Turkey Springs then ended with the warriors who were being pursued, then retreating cavalry for several miles. The engagement was the last armed conflict in Indian Territory between the U.S. cavalry and the American Indians, in which eventually the cavalry was able to capture the Indians. Now, this next part, boy, I'm really going to sum up very, very, very fast. I didn't plan on asking a whole lot of questions on this next part, but more tribes were relocated during this time period as well, put on reservations. Some would be removed from places like Kansas, some from much further away. You had the arrival of Sioux Indians who would be coming all the way from places like Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. The Ponca Indians would be coming in as well. The Nez Perce didn't really bring a whole lot down here. They mostly stayed in Washington. The Osage tribe gave up all of their land in Kansas here. They sold it and moved to the reservation that they had in Indian Territory. A lot of them were already in Indian Territory, but more came. The Quapaw had a reservation established during this time period. The Pawnee, the list goes on. A lot of Indian tribes were continuing to be removed and relocated to Indian Territory. Now, before I sign off, like last time I asked your favorite color, this time I'm going to ask something else. What is your favorite movie? You need to put this on your assignment. It's actually worth points. Can't really get it wrong. However, I do want you to choose one movie. It might be hard. Maybe you're like, I got 3 or 4. Try to narrow it down to one. Just let me know what your favorite movie is. Kind of fun just to know these things. My favorite movie, it is hard to say. Probably Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King is probably my favorite movie. Although I don't watch it that often because I have the extended version and it's like 4 hours long. I hope you guys are doing well. Of course, staying at home, you've got time to watch 4 hours movies if you'd like to. Signing off, we'll talk to you next week as we begin looking at chapter 11. Like I said, hope you're doing good. Bye.